Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos otra vez a nuestro Congreso. Welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our special guest, our keynote, Tom Moylan. I switch with Professor Pampro for the presentation. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Tom. First of all, we would like to thank Professor Moylan for agreeing to speak for us today and for agreeing to do so with such enthusiasm. Tom Moylan hardly needs any introduction, as he is well known in the field of Utopian studies, both as a scholar and as an activist. But since this conference is attended by people from so many different backgrounds, I cannot resist introducing him briefly. Tom Moylan is a Glucksman Professor Emeritus in the School of English, Irish and Communication, and adjunct professor in the School of Architecture of the University of Limerick in Ireland. He has been and continues to be nowadays a point of reference for all of us who study the world of Utopías, as the founder of the Ralahine Centre for Utopian Studies and one of the editors of the Ralahine Utopian Studies book series. He has awarded in 2008 the Lyman Tower Sargent Distinguished Scholar Award by the North American Society for Utopian Studies, and in 2017 he was awarded the Pilgrim Award for lifetime contributions to science fiction and fantasy scholarship by the Science Fiction Research Association. His publications include Demanding Impossible, Science Fiction and the Utopian Imagination in 1986, Not Yet, Reconsidering Ernest Bloch, of which he was the editor with Jamie Owen Daniel in 1997, Scraps of the Untainted Sky, Science Fiction, Utopia, Dystopia in 2000. In 2004, he was the editor with Raffaella Baccolini of Dark Horizons, Science Fiction and the Dystopian Imagination. In 2007, he edited two collaborative books, one of them with Michael Griffin, Exploring the Utopian Impulse, Essays on Utopian Thought and Practice, and the other with Raffaella Baccolini, Utopia, Method, Vision, the Use Value of Social Dreaming. He has also coordinated several special issues of the journal Utopian Studies on various aspects of utopianism, and he has written numerous essays on utopia, dystopia, and political agency. His new book, Becoming Utopian, The Culture and Politics of Radical Transformation, a very interesting book, has been published by Bloomsbury in last year, 2020. Today, he will talk about Choosing Utopia, Becoming Utopian, Reflections on Praxis. Professor Moylan, welcome home. You can start whenever you like.
For starters, and greetings from the banks of the Shannon River in Limerick. And thank you, Juan Pro, for your kind introduction. Can I ask if the sound is coming across? I hear nothing. To the moderator, can I ask if the sound is coming through?
Yes, it's okay. It's okay, Tom.
Okay, I'll continue. I'm honored to be able to contribute to this important conference with its emphasis on real utopias in history, on lived and engaged utopianism. Before I start, I want to express my deep appreciation to Professor Juan Pro and the organizing and scientific committees of the Congress for their initial invitation, and then for their gracious and very patient willingness to work with me when it turned out that I couldn't fully participate. I'm very grateful and happy to join with you all in utopian solidarity. What follows is a further reflection on the argument of my recent book, Becoming Utopia. While I do not speak to the immediate topic of intentional communities, I hope I can offer a broader framing discussion of the utopian process in real utopian instances. And as I consider yet again the long-standing question of what is to be done. Today, then, I will address the impact of our current dire moment on utopian engagement, especially as refracted through the thoughtful writing of the philosopher Shreko Horvat, as he helps us think through and critically beyond this current, apparently apocalyptic moment. I'll offer two opening quotations to offer this poetic imaginary to this paper. First is from William Butler Yeats. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And the second is from Bob Dylan. There must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the thief. There's too much confusion. I can get no relief. Systemic crises and existential suffering have plagued humanity for a very long time. Throughout the last century, the world teetered on the edge of destruction, with human and non-human life pulled into the crushing gears of economic, military, political, and cultural orders, as profit and power prevailed over justice and well-being. In this century, the downward spiral has exponentially increased, such that the end of all life is now within the collective field of vision. Whether termed the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, or more reductively, the end time, William Butler Yeats's blood-dimmed tide is flooding the globe. Today, cataclysmic harm abounds everywhere. The overdetermined crises playing out at every level have intensified even further under the imbricated realities of climate and pandemic destruction, as this toxicity intertwines with greed, hatred, and violence, threatening the viability of all the planet's inhabitants, most clearly those who are the most hated, most dispossessed, most vulnerable. In the face of this dark totality, of his threatened order, as Bob Dylan sings, there must be some way out of here. Today, for those of us in all our intersectional situations and endeavors, who seek to challenge and transform our current reality in the spirit of a just, equal, and ecologically healthy existence for all humans and non-human nature, it is clearly time for the transformative exercise of the insurgent hope of the utopian impulse. In this undertaking, we need to know and act on the broken ground upon which we all walk, no longer to survive our condition, much less to manage it, but rather to threaten the very order itself, in collective action that robustly acts in the moment, even as it reaches toward a radical horizon of concrete transformation, rather than getting lost in a miasma of abstract platitudes and gratuitous reforms. There have, of course, been many critical and revolutionary responses to this dire period, challenging how we understand it and how we might change it. Among this array of counter-hegemonic interventions, one that has recently spoken truth to me with its sober clarity and acute articulation of what must be done is Shreko Horvat's After the Apocalypse. From the very first page, the author mobilizes a radical hermeneutic analysis in the service of revolutionary political action. Horvat identifies a standpoint from which he addresses what he terms our contemporary apocalypse in this way, quote, "We are all living through it, deeply entangled and personally shaken by its revelations, engulfed by its warnings, and yet the attempt to imagine the unimaginable needs to be taken if we are to understand what is at stake, namely extinction." Importantly, in these words, he traces the root cause of this complex reality to the, quote, "decades of neoliberalism and centuries of capitalism as the dominant world system based on extraction, exploitation, and expansion produce the current apocalyptic conditions as it has, quote, infected our bodies and our minds as well as society and nature. What is at stake, he argues, is, quote, the future of the planet itself." To address this apocalyptic situation, where a bleak future has actually arrived within our present time, in the long durée of destruction which is unfolding now as the causative past of that entropic time to come, Horvath proffers 9 theses on apocalypse that clarify what I would identify as the radical, systemic, and existential process of becoming utopian. In this, he evinces a praxis that I would term totalizing in its analysis of interrelated crises, transgressive in its call for action, and transformative in its intent to produce alternative outcomes that lead toward a horizon of justice and freedom, health and well-being for all humanity and all of nature, for the planet itself. Horvath's opening thesis challenges the prevailing sense of linear and one-dimension temporality by declaring that the once future condition of extinction has already happened if we humans persist in working with the terms and conditions of the order shaped by the current barbarism. We are, he says in a profoundly prophetic voice, quote, living in the naked apocalypse without a kingdom to come. Hope is erased under these conditions in which the end of the world has invaded the present with no alternative in sight. Quote, no new epic after this already dystopian epic. And yet, what I would identify as a utopian imperative or impulse pervades Horvath's writing as he refuses to deliquesce into the swamp of barbaric despair, as he offers a way to deeply interpret the current material and semiotic conditions in order to argue that, quote, another end of the world is still possible. Another end of the world is still possible. Horvath's second thesis unfolds this radical hermeneutic by which he reads the signs of our times. He reminds us that the original Greek word apocalypse is not a synonym for the end of the world, not a conflation that simply reinforces linear time privileged by the current world order, but rather another word for revelation, insofar it is, quote, an unveiling of the architecture of our world, both as place and time. Understood so as unveiling or revelation, apocalyptic discourse can generate the interpretive intervention required to expose the conditions producing this apparently an inescapable extinction. Not to lock in that ending, but rather to challenge its inevitability, to produce, quote, an unprecedented transgenerational and intergenerational mobilization that would create the political subject capable of pulling the emergency brake on the downward spiraling of totalizing finality. Proceeding from this, his third thesis calls for a semiotic struggle for meaning that could enable humanity in what I would call a utopian reading to reassert control, to take on the interconnected social and environmental spheres that have been produced by, as he puts it, hyper-integrated world capitalism that destroys the biosphere through continuous extraction and expansion. Such a counter-narrative would pull together the range of movements challenging and working to transform the current order of things, about which we're hearing many at this conference. Quote, connecting the various heterochronicities and heterotopias in a unified rage. To do so, in Theses 4 and 5, Horvath diagnostically deconstructs the tropes of apocalyptic melancholy and normalization that sustain the present order. He calls for this containing discourse of surface realism to be negated and superseded by a post-apocalyptic narrative that, quote, navigates us beyond the reductionist linear notion of time embodied in the capitalist understanding of progress, and points us toward the realization that a transformatively healing and liberating world can still be achieved. In Thesis 4, drawing on Freud and Benjamin, Horvath begins his move from a negative hermeneutics of suspicion to a positive hermeneutics of radical anticipation, as he argues that the debilitating melancholy produced by a perception that argues that the planet, with all its creatures, is no longer capable of surviving, can still be transformed into a fruitful dialectical mourning that is not trapped in the current of dark anxiety, but rather refuses to relinquish the hope that, quote, unprecedented political action can offer a way out of our contemporary deadlock. Such a constructive response is rooted in what Ernst Bloch would term the temporal solidarity of our taking on, quote, the responsibility toward future generations to properly understand and minimize the already existing eschatological threats, and therefore embracing the thought to construct a different end of the world, to construct a different end of the world. Going further in Thesis 5, Horvath argues that it is in the interest of the current ruling order to legitimate itself as inherently normal, with only a managerial need for ameliorating reforms. And he then asserts that such an apparent renewal produces not a better world, but a more terrible, more controlled and enclosed replication of the existing world. Thus, a new normal reveals itself in a greater degree of, quote, mass surveillance, restriction of movement, authoritarian capitalism, further exploitation of labor and natural resources, as well as in intensified immiseration of the so-called essential workers who keep the system running. Horvath exposes this return to normal mythology as one that darkly means, quote, a return to the vicious circle of never-ending expansion, extraction, and exploitation, which led to the multiple and simultaneous eschatological threats that we are facing today: climate crisis, nuclear age, pandemics. Consequently, the radical response to this regime of normality must be one that renders that order as systemically and existentially abnormal. Further developing this revolutionary narrative of another world, in Thesis 6, Horvath acknowledges that the planet and its inhabitants are at the tipping point of irreversible change. The quantitative accumulation of exploitation and destruction is well on its way to producing qualitative cascade that is on the verge of being, quote, beyond human control and also beyond our imagination. In Thesis 7, he argues that this catastrophe has exceeded the limits of human understanding, thus debilitating interventions because, quote, no human can fully cope with the glimpse into a future without history. Having broken through the dominant discourse of doom by way of this post-apocalyptic hermeneutic, Horvath mobilizes what I would term an explicitly utopian response as he argues for a dynamic capacity for understanding, one that can fuel a globally transformative movement that can stem the tide, that can struggle for another way out of this particular threatened order. In Thesis 8, he calls for a new eschatology that refuses the unilateral notion of capitalist time. To develop this alternative, the current disastrous conditions demand the challenge of a contrapuntal imagination of a future that comes after the apocalypse. This endeavor, he argues, quote, can only be successful if it is grounded in a deep understanding of the eschatological tipping points as we are faced with, as well as in an unprecedented long-term collective action that is at the same time both spatial, local, transnational, planetary, and temporal, intergenerational solidarity, and a commitment to a just and sustainable future that would eventually be distributed across the planet among all species. Only by tearing open the sutures of a linear timeline of power and progress, therefore, can a different end of the world be imagined and constructed. In Thesis 9, Horvath climaxes his intervention with his call for a radical reinvention of the world as the only way to negate, quote, mass extinction. Taking up the transformative slogan that another world is possible, against the resigned pessimism that preserves the powers of the current order, he argues that another end of the world is possible. Thus, the revelation that Horvath uncovers in his radical hermeneutic presents all of humanity with a choice to continue, if caught in our one-dimensional melancholic normality, to go along with the fossilized status quo based in extraction, exploitation, and further expansion. Or, in what I would call a utopian break, to use our general, quote, our general intellect and imagination, our strong sense of transnational justice and intergenerational solidarity in order to go beyond the apocalypse, to go beyond the very notion of time and progress. Only with such a revolutionary leap as a radical utopian maneuver can we redefine time and existence and work toward a new planetary commons that meets the embraided needs of humanity and the earth itself. Now, for me, Horvath's theses function eloquently as what Kathy Weeks would call a utopian manifesto for our threatened world order. One that calls not for management of such threats, but rather for superseding them by way of totalizing transformation. Yes, another world, a different, better world, if possible, is possible. However, to work successfully within the refunctioned eschatological scope that Horvath identifies, immense personal and collective action is required. Action that stays with the trouble, as Donna Haraway puts it, as it challenges the array of destructive elements in the present moment, even as it pushes forward to a better horizon. It is from this point that the process of becoming utopian can more fully inform the steps to such radical change. I therefore suggest that the theoretical and methodological approaches made possible by the utopian problematic, such as those being very well articulated at this conference, can help us to better understand and better engage in the process of this revolutionary leap, and as it is enabled by radical critique and anticipatory articulation, perhaps especially in the work of teaching and organizing. As Frederick Jameson reminds us, the utopian problematic provides a critical apparatus by which the surface realism of the official capitalist order is exposed and superseded by utopian action that offers a way forward to a horizon of a more fulfilled and healthy existence for humanity and all of nature. As Jameson also reminds us, however, the successful deployment of this praxis requires an initial catalyzing utopian impulse, as well as diverse yet allied real political programs that give it shape and direction. Or in what our utopian colleague Ruth Levitas's formulation has it, which echoes Horvath's argument, the utopian method of this praxis involves two dialectically related moves. One, an archaeological mode of deep interpretation that involves, quote, piecing together the images of the good society that are embedded in political programs, in social and economic policies, or as Ernst Bloch would put it, in the traces in utopian surplus. And the other, an architectural mode of creative revelation, which consists of the imagination of potential alternative scenarios for the future. However, these dual practices must be accompanied by her positing of a third, agential mode, quote, which addresses the question of what kind of people particular societies develop and encourage, and which then moves from interpretation to practice. Here then, it's important to emphasize that this process of becoming utopian intensifies in the journey of the individual into the social collective. Simply put, the power of a collective utopian movement is located in each person who comprises it. But for each person, for that person to be of that movement, she or he need to become utopian and continue to become utopian. This requires the individual to break from the ideological formation by which she or he has been interpolated, to tear through its sutured confines, and then to revision the existing one-dimensional world order and their place in it, to see that something is missing, as Bloch and Adorno have it, and that something better can be achieved. I believed, and what I've argued in my book, that we can better understanding the deep transformation that occurs in this radical reconstruction of an individual, and consequently of a socio-political collective, if we grasp it as utopian. For me, this conversion is clarified by Gestalt therapy's social psychological understanding of the process of the Gestalt shift, recognized by the psychotherapist Fritz Perls and the anarchist Paul Goodman, and further developed through Alain Badiou's political articulation of the eventual break, especially as he presents it in his book on St. Paul, wherein he evokes that historical person not as a revered saint or authoritarian enforcer, but rather as a militant figure whose life most effectively exemplifies the process of overturning that takes place at the puncto moment of a ruptural event. One that opens the way to the transformation of relations between the possible and the impossible, between the world as it is and as it could be. While many individuals who become utopian no doubt do so through a titrating series of shifts or breaks, there are indeed moments of acute crisis, as figured by Paul, in which change is instantly crystallized. But in all cases, slow or fast, the transformation is a form of radicalization. This then is a process that reaches deep into the depths of the historical order, that permeates the normative subject, and creates a radical shift wherein the individual's holistic perception of reality radically alters in the estranging break that leads to a desire for a better world. With this individual utopian break or gestalt shift or turn, however, the journey only begins. For the ongoing expansion of the education of utopian desire, of an active hope, involves not only learning, but affiliating and working with others in this transformative vocation as part of a community or a collective. What shape that activity takes is, of course, a key political question in any historical moment. Minimally, it can begin with singular participation as a concerned citizen, but it then must, to be effective, develop into more organized activism in once-off protests, targeted campaigns, sustained mass mobilizations. And so growing from the micro-utopian, or what Heather McKnight has called the nano-utopian, to the macro, it may take the form of party or para-party formations, or other organized communities of life and action, such as the intentional communities, the eco-barrios and villages, the cooperatives that we have been hearing about at this conference. An extensive discussion of the question of the most appropriate political formation must wait for another time. But whatever way this socio-political process develops, in Badiou's terminology, it will involve a collectively guided operation of subjectification that runs from the singularity of the individual break into an incorporation within, a synthesis of politics, history, and ideology that produces what he calls a subjective capacity and organization that is carried forward in a political formation or political formations that has or have the capacity to bring that impossible into the possible. For his part, as for many, Badiou argues that the traditional party formation is no longer capable of this global political work, and he therefore suggests other possibilities, such as those found after the event of May 68, or in more recent political movements. For myself, I do accept Jodi Dean's argument in her wonderful book, Comrade, for the necessity of a unified organization that embodies the utopian surplus of the historical Communist Party, insofar as it is equal to the work of countering the systemic power of a global, patriarchal, racist, capitalist order. However, at this moment, such an organization is damaged by its own vexed and tragic history, and it requires a refunctioned form that still lingers at the horizon of a more developed historical moment. Thus, I share the assessments of the likes of Antonio Negri and Badiou, and for now value the intermediate organizational forms capable of mediating between grassroots activity and the desired organizational force of a party structure, as seen in a random and fluid set of examples in Momentum in the UK, in the Democratic Socialists or the Black Lives Matter in the US, the Indignados in Spain, or as we've been hearing today, the Zapatistas in Mexico, or in many other movements. In other words, while spontaneous uprisings, temporary occupations, and identity-based formations are crucially needed and effective in their own right, I would argue that it's necessary to move with and beyond local and sectoral struggles and to develop a global counterforce with a unified leadership structure, albeit one that is radically intersectional and democratic and governed by practices of criticism, self-criticism, but In order to sustain a political movement that can work against global neoliberal superpower orders, or reaching toward a utopian horizon by building new political, social, and cultural spaces or formations within this apocalyptic moment of what Mark Fisher has called the remorseless meat grinder of capital. And so I would suggest that becoming utopian can name the trajectory of those who break with their compliant formation, having come to relearn the world and to imagine that it could be radically other, and who now act as strangers in what has been rendered an unfamiliar land. Effectively engaging with this process requires that we, in all of our diversity, become aware of the process in order more effectively to embark on its path. In our own dark times, armed with this understanding and this commitment to contribute to the general activity of becoming utopian, we need to act within this darkness. We cannot afford to indulge in nostalgia for former identities or politics. Nor can we abstractly wish that a transformed future will simply arrive on our doorstep. We certainly cannot give up or submit. No, we must take on the apparently impossible work of achieving the end of capitalist and superpower rule by joining the long march of building new spaces, creating new possibilities with compassion and cooperation. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Moylan. We can have now some minutes, maybe 10 minutes, to make questions or commentaries to the speech. Who wants to speak first?
Thank you very much, Professor Moylan, for your inspiring conference. In your latest work, Demand the Impossible, you discuss with Hugh O'Connell the utopian imaginaries present in May 68. And in that sense, I'd like to ask you if, from your point of view, the youth revolts of those years connected in a certain sense with the previous utopian tradition, or rather, for you it implies the birth of new approaches to utopia.
I think that's an important question, and thank you for asking it, and thank you for your comment. Unlike many who are eager to put May 68 behind, I'm not. Not because I'm a dinosaur nostalgically clinging to it, but because, in terms of the Jews' sense, it was an event. It was a ruptural break, which at that historical time was a major move in terms of the overall micro and macro movements and activities to radically change the world, to end the order of capitalism and, at that time, very warlike superpowers, as well as hatred and racism. And I'm not one to set aside the old left, although I am one to set aside the Stalinist old left without hesitation. But there was much to be gained by the Popular Front and Trotskyists and other left-wing formations that had preceded in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, which tripped over themselves by not coming to terms with this new moment, but which also were severely, globally and locally suppressed through anti-communist discourses and, in fact, practices. And we see them continuing today. Take Turkey, for example. And so what rose up was a new generation, the baby boom generation, a new growth of young people, first of all, appearing in the 1950s as teenagers, which was both a term of self-identity and commodification, because the new consumer system sold being a teenager back to young people. But then it grew with the movements of the civil rights movement. And now I'm going to speak from the US because that was my experience. I think there are resonances elsewhere, but I'll stick to what I experienced and know. The civil rights movement itself was regenerated by a youth movement of students and young people, first in the South and then in the North, first in groups like SNCC and then in groups like the Panthers. They learned to work against and with their older leaders, and they taught their older leaders, such as King, to be much more radical. And then they came to terms with the new sexual economy in terms of the women's movement and the politics of choice and control over their own bodies. And then they came to terms with the war, the imperialist war in Vietnam, and in the US now with conscription, with the draft, with the choice to fight in that unjust war or not. So in that politics of choice, authentic choice, there, I think, were new forms of cultural and political action that emerged. A new independent youth movement was growing rapidly into what became an ongoing adult movement. Yes, it's true that that movement, parts of it, got commodified by contemporary capitalism. The countercultural parts got moved into a very traditional consumerist form of counterculture that really, as many people have well argued, fed the emerging machinery of neoliberalism. But there was a sense of radical political action that continued from the 60s, and to me, the most viable and vital part of that was in the movements of the 70s, which then gets shut down by the repressions of Reagan and Kohl and Thatcher. That's a quick history, sorry.
Okay, we have another question by the chat, I think, from Diana Palardi, our colleague in the USA. Hello, Diana. Are you hearing me? No? Diana?
Ya, no te escuchamos.
¿Tienes encendido el micrófono? Okay, Diana, write your question by the chat and we read it for Professor Moylan. And another question in the room? No more questions in the room? Well, we wait to the...
Okay. Diana says, how do you escape capitalist and linear time? Thank you, Diana.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How do you escape capitalist and linear time?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. My own answer would be that we can't escape it because we're caught in it all the time. It's impinging on our work lives, our everyday lives. It's pulling us forward and pulling us forward faster and faster, like the train in Snowpiercer. But I think what Horvath argues, and what I would suggest, and what others are, is that we can work to break that time, to shatter the force of its linearity, to open it up into alternative sidetracks or vectors that go elsewhere. And I think this conference is really a good example of projects, movements, communities that are themselves doing that very thing, breaking capitalist linear time, because they are marching to the beat of a different drum, as Henry David Thoreau put it. They are, and all of us in political movements are acting as what Robert Heinlein called strangers in a strange land, or strangers in a too familiar land, really. We are trying to live as though we are always already utopian subjects, even though we are still stuck in capitalist times. So there's a double consciousness, as W.E.B. Du Bois would put it. We are living both in this world, in this linear time, but trying to tease out the tendencies of latencies of what Ernst Bloch would call future time, future possibilities, the not yet. So in these very movements, in the Clark Jordan eco-village down the road from me, capitalist linear time is being worked against by the ecotopian time of the village. It's being worked against by the community activities. And I think we have to keep identifying these and talking about them, and more speaking together to do that. Sorry, that's a question that could go on all day.
Thank you so much, Professor Moylan. It was really a pleasure and an honor to have you here. And we really hope we will meet you in person sooner or later. And we end this keynote here. Thank you so much. And we will pass to another panel in a few minutes. Oh, no, there is another answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. It was...
There is another question, the last question in the room.
If we have time, I don't want to force the... Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me, Professor Moylan. It was a wonderful lecture. You mentioned that... Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you so much for the lecture. My question is, in this, if we need to have a new, collectivist utopian politics, through some new form of political organization or, whatever, how do we prevent that from being consumed by this, kind of capitalist neoliberal counterculture, which can somehow incorporate criticisms of it and inoculate them, as you've mentioned with some of the 60s things. So how do we do that without being absorbed by neoliberalism? Thank you.
Yeah, that is the key question. I've written that political movements that are organizing in this way, or that utopian movements overall, have what I call a half-life, to borrow from physics. That the radical energy, the radical movement, the utopian movement tends to run down by virtue of two forces. One is the external repression of, in this case, neoliberal capitalism, anti-radical thinking, attacks on critical race theory, all of the attacks that we see. So the pressures from the outside are there in a negative way. And then the pressures are there, as you well point out, to commodify what that we do by branding what Paul Piccone once called our radical movements as artificially negative, turning them into products that we can then offer for consumption. But inside, there's always the tendency to power struggles and power grabs, to egos, to people who rise up with a stronger voice, oftentimes male, oftentimes white, oftentimes educated, pulling against a much more popular movement and diverse movement. I think we always have to be aware that these tendencies will never go away. And I think one thing we can learn from the 60s, but it's happened elsewhere, is the process of criticism, self-criticism. It's the process of validating and emphasizing long conversations about our practice together, of being able to be self-critical with each other even as we are respectful, of being able to call each other on our tendency to power grabbing or our tendency to commodifying, and of being able to let go of agendas and create new ones. This is at the key of the argument of the critical utopias, to break away from blueprints and into movements. But it's that self-awareness and then self-reflective practice that has to happen over and over again at every level of a movement. And we can never stop it. Even after the revolution, even after the utopian achievements, there will still be a need to do all this.
Thank you so much again. And as before, we were really pleased by your presence and your illuminating speech. So thank you again. And thank you also to all the people that intervene, all the audience. And we will see you in a few minutes for another panel.